Welcome to Things You Can't Live Without, the science podcast where I, material scientist Dr Anna Pajewski, ask my very special guest to reveal the single item they just can't live without. Throughout this series so far, we've heard of electric bicycles, dictionaries, prosthetic legs, climbing equipment, and insulated vacuum flasks, all being things we can't live without. You might think that this list is a rather random collection of stuff, but what each of these items has in common is that their constituent materials are substances that have been mined, processed, and made into this myriad of objects. On this podcast, we find out from a host of experts who lift the lid on all the science and engineering that these processes entail. They also give us a technology forecast to help us understand what needs to happen for us to make this stuff greener. Today, I'm honoured to have with me a chemical biologist and explorer who travels to the most extreme jungles and ecosystems of our planet, searching for the tiniest creatures, from heat-loving microbes to Amazonian stingless bees, in order to create big changes in the world. Dr Rosa Vásquez Espinoza, welcome to Things You Can't Live Without.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's lovely to be here.
It's really great to have you. And Rosa, I imagine when you're spending your time researching in the Amazon, there are lots of essentials that you have to take with you. But if I could press you for just one, is there one item above all others that you just can't live without?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question because there's just way too many items. But I would say my number one as a scientist and explorer is my field microscope. I have plenty, but this is kind of my favorite because it has this camera that then allows me to be able to record and also show whoever is around me on my team or the communities kind of what I'm magnifying.
That's so exciting. As a scientist, I love microscopes and I'm very excited to talk to you about this more. And today we're joined by another exploration expert who operates in a completely different world to you. It's Rio Tinto's Managing Director of Studies, Alison Morley. Welcome, Alison.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Rosa. I'm really excited to be here.
Pleasure. Very, very excited to talk to you. But firstly, Rosa, can you tell us the story of how you first fell in love with the Amazon?
So I grew up in Peru. And I have family that comes both from the high Andes mountains as well as the luscious forest of the Amazon. And so growing up, I attended school in the capital city, just like any big city, London-like. But every summer, I would be basically going to visit my relatives, cousins, uncles, and aunts, whether that meant learning how to literally cultivate potatoes in the Andes, or spending time crossing the Amazon River in tiny wooden traditional boats, playing with monkeys literally on our heads, getting fruits right from the rainforest. And my grandmother is a traditional healer. She never had the chance to attend school, but she lived with us in the city. And so she built her own kind of natural pharmacy where I spent every single time I was not in school. I spent it with her, with this Andean and Amazonian combination of plants. And so the Amazon has just been rooted in me since I'm a child.
Wow, that sounds like an idyllic childhood and a very adventurous one as well.
Yeah, I never really appreciated, I think, enough the fact that it's so unique to do that. And not until I moved to the US and other places to pursue science, that's so incredible to have that closeness to such unknown biodiversity in many cases. And that's kind of really what drove me to do the work I do now.
So can you tell us a bit more about that? What sort of research projects do you work on?
So I'm a chemical biologist, and basically it means I look at the tiniest life forms that most often go ignored, specifically in the Amazon. And so that means from looking at microbes that may be living in boiling rivers that we have in the jungle, or tiny insects that nobody that does not live in the jungle would know about. And I look at the chemistry, the molecules they may be producing, as well as their genetics, how their DNA makeup may have an influence on how they live within a whole ecosystem, but as well as how they contribute to it, perhaps even giving us tools to help medicine, bioremediation, and even help with conservation in the jungle itself.
Wow. Okay. So from the very small to the very large then, but kind of focusing on how changes in the very small insects or the chemistry that's going on down at the tiny scales gives rise to big ecosystem changes.
Yeah, in a way. And all my work, because of that scientific training, but indigenous upbringing is really rooted hand in hand with indigenous knowledge. And so I'm indigenous descent myself. And so all the work that we do is not just purely going to academic journals, but on top of that, we also really bring in close collaborations with indigenous leaders. So then we can translate these studies or even design them in a way that they have direct conservation impact in a positive way in the lands where we are doing our work.
That's so interesting. Do you have any favourite examples of projects that kind of, I guess, exemplify this relationship between people, place, and your research?
Yeah, it's with the Peruvian boiling river, which is an insane boiling river that reaches temperatures over 90 Celsius. And yet you have a variety of microorganisms that are just thriving there.
Amazing.
And basically studying this microdiversity could help understand how life came to be in the rainforest, how we could perhaps use them as a model to understand how climate change is impacting the rainforest, and perhaps even finding tools to help combat that.
That's incredible. So Rosa, can you tell us a bit about how these sorts of exploratory expeditions work?
Once you get there, I would say that the next greatest challenge is the actual navigation of the river. You have this constant, intense vapor that can make you dizzy. There was this one specific moment where we got to one part of the river where the water was maybe 80 Celsius, so not your hottest, but still pretty damn intense. They had told me that on the other side of one specific section of the river was an area that was quite pristine because nobody virtually went to that space because you needed to climb over a certain wall to be able to get to the other side. Of course, as a scientist, that sounds exciting because that means they have the least amount of contamination. They could really give me the cleanest view as to how this life looks like.
Yeah.
They call it the Spider-Man wall because once you start climbing it, there's a section where you physically need to get your arm all the way to the other side in one single movement at the same time as your leg, because that's the next space where you can actually hold yourself safe from to be able to cross it. Not only are you having this intense river below you with all this vapor coming out of it, but the rock itself, there were critters like spiders and other things. So not only had I to be extremely careful with my grip and my movements, but I had to ignore everything else that was kind of going in and around, you know?
Rosa, you're the most badass person I've ever met. This is amazing. Going back to your microscope then, how does the use of this piece of kit help you to understand these different ecosystems better?
There are certain kind of microbes that many of them grow together in a community. They may look just like kind of these dark green algae to the naked eye, but when you put them under a microscope and magnify them, even if it's just, 200 times what you would normally see things at, the microscope really was fascinating at being able to tell us within a second if the sample we were looking at was something we were actually interested in collecting, and simplifying a lot of the steps after that.
Can either of you guess how old the technology of microscopes is?
All I can think of is Galileo, but I think he was telescopes, wasn't he? Not microscopes.
That's true. I guess it's a similar sort of technology though, but yeah. Any guesses, Rosa?
Yeah, no, I should know this answer. And I feel really bad. I don't know it off the top of my head.
No, this isn't an attempt to shame you. I didn't know, but I did some research. There was a big development of technology in microscopes and telescopes around the sort of 1600s when you're talking about. But way, way, way before that, there are ancient Chinese texts from 4,000 years ago describe water-based microscopes. So how light is bent by different shapes of water. If you've ever got water on your phone screen, actually, you'll know what this looks like. It kind of magnifies all the little pixels on your phone screen. The ancient Chinese were making tiny, tiny microscopes like that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Amazing. And the ancient Greeks and Romans were also really into glass, and they did make glass lenses. So it's possible that the ancient Greeks and Romans also had forms of microscopes thousands of years ago. Then there's a bit of a leap in the history of microscopes to around the year 1600, which is when, I guess, the study of alchemy and science as we know it today was starting to kind of form a bit more formally. So these early microscopes around the year 1600, they could magnify about 20 to 30 times. But in the 1660s, a Dutchman called Antoine van Leeuwenhoek made microscopes that could magnify up to 200 times. So this was a massive step forward. And with his microscope, he observed animal and plant tissue, human sperm cells, blood cells, minerals, fossils, and loads of other things that had never been seen before on this microscopic scale. And by the 20th century, we were able to enjoy not only zooming in using light, but zooming in using electrons. And electron microscopes have much, much higher resolution, thousands of times more than we can see with a light microscope. Today's digital microscopes, like yours, Rosa, combine ordinary microscope lenses with digital light sensors, which enable us to magnify and record the images on a digital screen. The discoveries made by all these different types of microscopes, are endless. Understanding what the building blocks of plant and animal matter are, and non-living matter as well in the atoms, they all owe their discoveries to microscopes. And by understanding the very, very small, we then come to understand a bit about the very, very large.
That's very cool. Yeah, that's a fantastic timeline.
So from an Amazonian explorer to now a geological one, I'd love to turn to you, Alison, and hear a bit more about your work in exploration and discovery. Because for you, explorations look like something a bit different from Rosa's. So what does exploration look like for you?
Look, there's some differences, but there's an awful lot of similarities. I found myself nodding along a lot with Rosa as she was speaking. So ultimately, I've spent 25 years in the mining sector, many of that doing exploration, and you're looking for concentrations of minerals or metals that are economic. That's what you're ultimately looking for. The key thing that you're really looking for is differences in the rock. There's usually some reason why a certain mineral or a certain element will concentrate in a certain place. And that might be because there's a fault there or a structure, and that encourages a lot of fluid flow to go through a particular part of ground. It might mean that there's a particular bit of ground that's really chemically different from another bit of ground. So as a geologist, what you're really looking for is one, those concentration of minerals that makes them rich enough to be mined, but then the way that you find them is by noticing differences in the Earth's crust that other people haven't noticed before.
And how do you use your knowledge of geological structures, I guess, combine it with new data to make these discoveries?
Oh, yeah. And, I think geology has changed a lot over the last couple of hundred years when it sort of started as a science. But maybe 30, 40 years ago, people were really using visual clues. So they might have been looking for a particular mineral on the surface. There's plenty of examples of big mines that were discovered because people noticed a blue or green staining on the surface and then realised that was a copper carbonate or a copper oxide, and they could follow that down to where the ore body is. And that was kind of like the old style of discovering ore bodies. What we've found in the last, say, 20, 30 years is we've got a whole bunch more technologies that we can now add to that. So your geologists that are out in the field are still really looking for those visual clues, but at the same time, they've got a lot of technology now that helps them look at these differences within the Earth's crust. So you're looking for different physical properties like electromag or magnetism or density or gravity, and we use a whole bunch of different tools for that. And the thing that had me nodding along with Rosa's conversation is that the nearest sort of analogy to Rosa's in-field microscope for a geologist is probably the hand lens, which is only, is very, very small. And whilst it might only get you to 10 or 30 times, depending on the hand lens, what it does is really give you a sense of what minerals that you're looking at. At the same time, we do have geologists who sit in a lab and they will look down lab microscopes at rocks. And I've got to say, the view down a lab microscope of a rock is something really amazing. So what you have to do with a rock, you can't just whack it in under the microscope. So what we do is that we make a thin section of the rock. So it's 30 microns thick, so you can hold it up to the light and see through it. And when you put that under a particular type of microscope, you can see straight through the rock. It means that you can identify what the rock types or the minerals are within that rock by colour, shape, cleavage. It's always a great word to use with undergraduates, which is how the rock breaks apart. And I've got to say, when you look down a microscope at a thin section, it's a magical experience. They are the most beautiful things. The colours are amazing.
And what's the reason that you shave them so thin? Is it so that you have that benefit of being able to look through and kind of discern the different rocks more easily?
That's exactly right. So it allows the light to pass through it in a way that is, standard across any different sections that you might have.
You're a bit like a forensic scientist, but of the earth. I love that.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I really love the idea, both of you actually kind of trudging around with various tools hanging off your belt, but actually quite similar approaches.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the difference in scales before, Anna. There's really fractal patterns in geology. So what you see down a microscope can often be what you see in your hand, and then what you see in the wall of a mine, and then what you see from an aerial photo looking above. You can still see these same patterns, and it's just magical.
Can you explain a bit more what you mean about the fractal patterns? So, a shape of a rock might be such under a microscope, and then you actually see kind of bigger versions of that as well?
Yeah, you can do that. So when you look at a rock sample in your hand, you can go, oh, okay, there's a sort of what we call a lineation or a fabric within the rock that shows you which way it's been squished, and you end up with these really beautiful patterns. But a geologist can look at them and go, well, this is the way that the rocks were squished. You can then apply that at the macro scale when you're sort of in a mine. You might be able to say, well, I know that fault from looking down my microscope moved in this direction. However, I don't know where this ore body's gone, but if I can tell that little bit of data about what I saw in the fault, maybe I can realise that the rest of the ore body is 100 or 200 or 50 kilometres down that way. And you can really use all the clues that you find at all scales to give you a sense of where you need to look next.
I love the analogy that you did, Alison, of like looking at something with your tools at this micro level and then kind of seeing the pattern emerge at a larger and larger level. The question I would have is an exploration experience you've had that just kind of like left you awestruck of like how beautiful earth crust or mineral, whatever it is that you were like looking at, or the location itself, that just kind of like hit you as to like, whoa.
Oh, wow. I think the more profound experience for me, so going to one of our exploration sites, driving through a very, very small community there, realising that there was no employment opportunities within that small community, that the young people were leaving town. You could see the town was really kind of dying in front of your eyes. And then 15 kilometres out of town, we'd found a project that looked very, very prospective for manganese at the time. And just kind of realising that if I had the ability to make that project work, the opportunities I could bring to the young people of that town. So for me, there's that element of how do you make a good society? And I know that there's a lot of arguments against mining in that question, but there's a lot of arguments for mining within that question as well. So for me, it was how do I make sure that people in these far-flung places have the same opportunity for work, employment, and to better themselves as anybody else does.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, no, that's something, the human aspect of exploration is something that we also kind of really have naturally just focused on. I think traditionally science tends to occur outside of culture, but when you go to places, in my case, like the Amazon or the Andes, nature is intertwined with culture and it's unavoidable. And so I think that's how we approach our own explorations, which is science is intertwined with the people and the culture around. There's no two ways about it, and just finding a way to celebrate all of that.
Now, Dr. Rosa, I'm going to transport you to a terrible alternate universe in which, when you were climbing on your Spider-Man wall, you dropped your field microscope in the boiling river.
Oh, no.
You're now without it in the Amazon. What would you do? What would life be like without your microscope?
So just as a disclaimer, I haven't dropped any item in the Boiling River, but some of our colleagues accidentally did. And entire, very expensive, fancy cameras have completely melted with a lot of intriguing and unique material. So it happens. So, knock on wood. I think... it's also about going back to the basics. I think it is amazing to have all this technology nowadays. Of course, it allows us to do things faster, more accurate, look at things we were not able to see before. But I think in a way, nature exploration is also very inherent to human nature. There has been cases where we were not able to bring equipment for X, Y, and Z, or something happened and we just didn't have it with us. And I think it kind of reminds that there is this, perhaps detail of observation. Perhaps there's another factor I could be looking at. Perhaps it's the reflection. Is there a different type of intricate color that I could be taking attention to, or connecting it more to where in the rocks I'm finding this? I'm all for equipment, but also all for adapting, which is 100% unavoidable when you are in the field.
I love that. So you would adapt as you always do.
We have to. We've already had to. So,
No, for sure. But making anything has an inevitable impact on our planet. So I now want to think a little bit about where the stuff comes from. Alison, you're involved in sourcing the raw materials for Rosa's microscope. But I'm interested in where your work sits in the bigger picture, in the full story of mining.
So the exploration team are pretty much at the beginning of the story. So what you might end up with is a bunch of people in an office who have an idea. So they will generally then put that idea to an exploration manager who holds the budget. And then there's also the element of, can you pick up that ground? So there's a system in most countries where the ground is held by the government and you have to apply in order to be able to pick up that ground and go and explore it. And then once you've realised that there's a target there, then you usually get a whole bunch of people to go out to the ground. You might put some drill holes in. You might take some surface or some soil samples, and the idea is, of course, that you hit the big ore body right down the guts of it on the first hole. Very rarely happens that way. It usually takes a lot more holes and a lot more belief and a lot more convincing. So that's kind of exploration in a nutshell.
And is there a sustainability element to this? Are you trying to do your exploration work in a more sustainable way or a lower impact way?
Exploration itself is fairly light touch. It's not till you move further down the chain where the sustainability really has big impacts. But having said that, I would say that most of the geos I know absolutely drawn to geology because they love the environment and they are intrinsically sustainability obsessed people. So where it can be done, it is being done.
That's good to hear. Rosa, I know that you work with policymakers on this sustainability issue as well. What's your experience in doing so, and what is your hope? What are you trying to achieve by interacting with policymakers?
Yeah, we partner with environmental lawyers as well as stakeholders at multiple levels in the local areas. And so this really came about in the last few years after seeing the impact that our science and storytelling was having, and listen closely to what the communities were needing as to what the next step was, okay? We navigated conversations through different parts of ministries to understand where is it that we start a change that the communities see within their timeline, within, in short-term periods. So it involves a lot of conversation and bringing in the right messages, and then finding the people that are keen to support and that also, like Alison said, live and breathe in sustainability and understand that through their work, they can have quite direct impact.
I think there's an element there that, any decision like that's made with that real scientific, factual backing, that's the thing that gets me really excited, is being able to convince people with real data. So using your skill set to change the world is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to communication again, right?
Yeah, and I just make a comment as a geologist. I heard somebody the other day say something was as dumb as a rock, and I was sort of like, That just means you don't know how to read a rock, you know. We spend our whole careers learning how to read the rocks. So the rocks speak. You just got to know how to listen.
Listen to the rocks.
Yep.
Looking to the future, Alison, what's next for you? What are you most excited about at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of partnerships with startups, and what we're seeing now is this data explosion where you can actually get, you know, readings from satellites that are constant, you know, and so the amount of data that's coming at us is really a tsunami of data. So rather than just looking at the data, we need to understand how we pull the data apart. So I think there's a real piece there around data, AI within geoscience. And it's just fascinating. Geology is essentially pattern recognition, advanced pattern recognition. Now, at the moment, people do that better than anything, and I think that will probably remain the same. But if you can cut out some of the grunt work of that pattern recognition with AI, just imagine how powerful that could be.
What isn't AI helping us with?
So true.
And how about for you, Rosa? What explorations await you next?
In terms of the Amazon, we are creating the first map of stingless bees in partnership with the Ashaninka people. And so we are providing them with equipment and the training so that they can conduct science and basically really be able to generate the first visualization as to where these bees are, not just with the hope that it can inspire natural corridors and be able to protect it, be able to guide reforestation, but also futuristically with the hope that by studying their honey, we've noticed not only are we able to look at the medicinal properties of that honey, which traditionally is being known already by the communities, but also potentially looking at pollution. So we've been able to see that there is traces of pesticides or pharmaceutical pollutants that can be still detected in the honey. And so we're looking to submit that this year. I'm really excited for that.
Well, we've been on an exploration of our own this episode, from ancient Chinese water microscopes and boiling rivers to working with communities to ensure sustainable mining and ecosystems long into the future. Rosa Vásquez Espinoza and Alison Morley, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and passion for exploration.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's been fantastic and so lovely to meet you, Alison, as well.
I've had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
You can listen to more episodes of Things You Can't Live Without wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to follow, rate and review us to make sure that you don't miss an episode.